through, what is it, the organization?
Pals Haven.
Pals Haven, so for dogs and cats and pets. So I will turn it over to him. He's going to share with you a little bit more about whales today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Hello. It is great to be back. It's great to see you all again. Seeing you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Wow. Well, I'm really excited to be here to tell you about our incredible animal of the year, whales, which I'm sure you've probably seen a few of already this year if you've been hanging out near the coast. But we're just going to jump right into it because we have a lot to go over today. So you might remember me. My name is Finkelstein. I went to UC Davis to study animal science. And then I went to the University of San Francisco to study nonprofit administration. And now it's an honor to say that I'm a naturalist with the Pacific Beach Coalition. You've probably heard of the Pacific Beach Coalition. We do hundreds of cleanups per year, and we do other things like coastal habitat restoration, as well as environmental education like we're doing today. Now we have so much to talk about with these incredible animals. We're just going to jump right into things. So starting off with some basic whale anatomy. So if we take a look at whales, right up at the front, they have a streamlined rostrum that helps them glide through the water very efficiently. They have blowholes up at the top of their heads to let them breathe at the surface. They have a dorsal fin that allows them to stay stable while they're swimming. And they have flukes, or tail fins, to give them power to swim through the water. And finally, they have pectoral fins, which allows them to steer and maneuver. And so before we talk more specifically about whales, let's talk about who they're related to and how they're scientifically classified. So whales, as I'm sure you know, are mammals. And mammals all share a few very important key traits. For example, all mammals produce milk. Now, whales producing milk underwater and feeding that to their young, their calves, is a very tricky thing. So whales have evolved a few strategies to help them out with that. Number one, mother whales produce milk that's very fatty, almost 50% fat. So it's very thick and doesn't dissipate in the water. Number two, mother whales can actually forcibly eject their milk into the mouths of the calves. And number three, calves can actually curl their tongue, almost like a straw, to help them ingest that milk more easily. Now, another characteristic of mammals is that all mammals at some point in their life have hair or fur. All whales are born with hair. Some of them lose that over time, while others retain them. If we look at this humpback whale, and I'm sure you've seen the bumps on humpback whales before, those are actually called tubercles. And at the very tip, they have a tiny little hair. I know it's super hard to see, but there's a little hair up there. And that is almost like the whiskers on dogs and cats. They're very sensitive. They're connected to nerves, and they help them detect things in the water. Now, believe it or not, whales are very closely related to all of these animals. And one of the traits that these animals share is that they're even-toed. They have hooves. And I know what you're thinking. Wait a minute, aren't we talking about whales? Whales definitely don't have feet, and they certainly don't have hooves. So why are we talking about these animals? Well, while whales don't have hooves, their relatives do, and their ancestors did as well. Now I want you to think in your head, what is the closest living relative on land to whales? If you guessed hippos, then you were correct. Hippos are the closest living relative to whales on land. They split off or diverged evolutionarily from whales about 55 million years ago, but they share a common ancestor. Let's watch a very quick video about an animal called Pachycetus that is an ancestor of modern whales.
Will be built approximately like a wolf. It has teeth like a carnivorous mammal.
But unlike a wolf that has claws on the ends of its toes, Pachycetus had tiny toes. Pachycetus was a carnivore that hunted on land. But its anatomy suggests it had adapted to living in water. Its long snout, full of sharp teeth, also allowed it to probe shallow riverbeds for prey. Its eyes were squeezed onto the top of its head, so it could keep watch while swimming. And some scientists think markings on its foot bones are evidence it had webbing between its toes, allowing it to hunt underwater.
Why was Pachycetus spending so much time in the water? I think it was because the water was full of fish. And judging from its teeth, it's pretty clear that they were taking advantage of that, going in the water, feeding on the fish, and didn't have much competition. And of course, it didn't take long until they moved into the water more permanently.
Pachycetus marks the beginning of an eventful journey from land animals to today's gigantic whales.
So that's a great video. It's called When Whales Could Walk, and it's on YouTube. So I encourage you to go check it out if you have time. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how we transitioned from an animal like Pachycetus that doesn't really look anything like modern whales into today's incredible, beautiful animals. This is another very short little clip that shows some of the animals that Pachycetus evolved into along the way on its journey to becoming modern whales.
X was just one change whales underwent as they adapted to life in the ocean. To survive in this underwater environment, whales' limbs grew stronger, making swimming easier. They grew horizontal flukes on the ends of their tails, and front limbs began to turn into flippers for stability and steering. As they moved to tail-powered swimming, their bodies became more streamlined, hind limbs shrank, and their spines grew longer. They had become fully aquatic and were unable to return to the land.
So it's pretty incredible to see that transition, right? Yeah, very interesting. So now that we know a good bit about whales' ancestors, let's finish identifying today's modern whales. When we say whales, we are talking about cetaceans. And cetaceans include whales, dolphins, and porpoises. All of these animals are very closely related. And really the biggest difference between them is their size. If a cetacean is large enough, we're going to call it a whale. Now, all cetaceans are carnivores, whether it's plankton, fish, or even seals. Those are all types of animals, and whales hunting them makes them carnivores. So whales, of course, are the biggest hunters on the planet. But how do they hunt? Well, that depends on whether a whale has teeth like us, or if they have baleen. So we're going to talk about toothed whales first. Whales can be grouped into two different groups, either toothed whales or baleen whales. And toothed whales are known as odontoceti. Odont means tooth, and ceti refers to whale. And there are 73 different species of toothed whales, including sperm whales, belugas, beaked whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And they hunt giant squid, fish, and other creatures who are living very deep down in the ocean, where almost no light penetrates. And now you might be thinking to yourself, if there's almost no light for them to see, how are they hunting their prey? Well, they have a very special organ and a very special ability. Toothed whales are able to use echolocation. So just like bats, they're able to use sound and clicks to be able to find their prey. They have an organ in their head called a melon, which is kind of a funny name for an organ in your head. It works pretty well. Now, what happens is, toothed whales will produce sound near the front of their heads, which will reflect back through their melon and the sound gets modified through their melon, and then will bounce off of their skull and go through the melon again, and it will come out almost like a laser beam, but for sound. And now that beam of sound will travel through the water until it hits something solid, like the sea floor, another whale, or the prey that they're hunting for. And when that happens, the sound will bounce back, and interestingly, it will actually be received or picked up by the whale's lower jaw. Once it's done that, once it's been picked up by the lower jaw, it will be channeled into their ears where they'll be able to hear and get an idea of where that object is. Now we're going to watch another very short little video that shows what we were just talking about. By the way, sperm whales are by far the loudest animals on Earth. The clicks they can produce are so loud, they can be louder than a jet engine taking off. Amazing, right? Now they are using these clicks to hunt very, very deep down in the ocean. But how deep exactly? Well, we have a helpful little chart to help us understand that. Sperm whales are able to dive to about 7,000 feet below the surface of the ocean. And they can hold their breath for about an hour and a half. Now, as incredible as that is, there are other toothed whales who can actually do even better. For example, Cuvier's beaked whale can actually dive to around 10,000 feet below the surface of the ocean. That is almost 2 miles below the surface of the ocean. And they can hold their breath for a whopping 3.5 hours. I want you to picture in your head coming to school, taking a big breath, and then holding your breath until lunchtime. That's basically what these creatures do multiple times a day. Now, I've talked a little bit about beaked whales, but interestingly, beaked whales don't actually have a beak. Instead, they have 2 front teeth on their lower jaw. The males do. And what's really interesting about beaked whales is they don't use their teeth for hunting. Instead, males will use them with other males of the same species for competition. When beaked whales want to hunt, they will actually use a very interesting strategy where they will dive down, they will use their echolocation to find their prey, and once they get close, they will open their mouth, they will curl their tongues, and then they will take in a big gulp of water, creating suction. And that suction will actually pull the prey into their mouths where they're able to clamp down. So very interesting, amazing animals. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about baleen whales. So baleen whales are also known as mysticeti or whalebone whales. And there are 16 different species of 14 different species of baleen whales, which include humpbacks, gray, fin, minke, bowhead, and right whales. And they diverged evolutionarily or split off from toothed whales around 34 million years ago. Now, baleen whales have baleen instead of teeth. And you're actually very familiar with what baleen is made out of. It's made out of keratin, which is the same substance that makes up your fingernails and your hair. Now, when we examine a single plate of baleen, like this right here, which is from a bowhead whale, this is actually a relatively short piece from a bowhead whale that can get much longer than this, you can really see and feel the resemblance to fingernails and hair. The plate really does look and feel like fingernails, and the bristly parts, which are going to be the internal parts, really does look and feel like hair. Now, baleen whales are feeding on very small creatures, like small small fish like anchovies or krill and other types of plankton. Now they take in massive amounts of water and they will use their baleen to trap these tiny little prey. They will actually use their tongues to force water through the many plates of baleen that they have and trap those animals on the bristly, hair-like parts of the baleen. And once they've done that, they'll use their tongues to scrape the inside of the baleen and then swallow all of those prey. Now they can use very advanced hunting techniques, even very social hunting techniques, like this group of humpback whales who are creating a bubble net to ensnare their prey. But that's not the only techniques that baleen whales have, and depending on the species, they can do some very interesting things, like this gray whale over here actually feeds on the bottom of the ocean. It will go and take big scoops of mud and filter that mud for tiny little crustaceans like crabs and shrimp. And when we examine a piece of baleen from a gray whale, we can really see how it's very different from that bowhead whale. It's much shorter, and it has very thick bristles, which are better able to filter through that mud. Let's take a look at some humpback whales feeding in action. And one thing I want you to pay attention to is how their throats are actually able to expand, almost like an accordion, to be able to take in these large amounts of water. And you're gonna see now beautiful, amazing creatures. And before we move on, there's one other distinction between toothed whales and baleen whales that we need to talk about. And that's actually the number of blowholes that they have. So baleen whales will have 2 side-by-side blowholes. And what's interesting is it can kind of look like an upside-down nose. Now, toothed whales, on the other hand, only have 1 blowhole. Like the sperm whale, for example, just has 1 near the front of its head. And what's really interesting is that you can actually identify the species of whale that you're looking at based on the type of spout that comes up when the whales come up to the surface to breathe. For example, this sperm whale over here, we can see that its spout actually shoots at roughly a 45-degree angle forward. So its spout is going forward. While these other whales, even though all these other whales are different types of baleen whales, they still have unique spouts. So this right whale, for example, actually has 2 side-by-side spouts, while, of course, this gray whale over here, or sorry, blue whale, will have a very, very large single spout. Now I want to talk a little bit about the different types of whales that we have along the west coast. If you are on the beach here and you see a whale offshore, it is most likely one of 2 species. Either it's going to be a humpback whale, or it's going to be a gray whale. Gray whales are migrating through. They're just passing us by. They're heading from Mexico roughly up to around Canada and Alaska. They are going to be here right now in April and in May. And then the humpback whales are actually spending the summers feeding around this area. So they're hanging out and staying with us from May to roughly October. Now, the reason that these whales are hanging out around the west coast is because we have a very interesting natural phenomena called the upwelling. And the upwelling is a pretty simple process, but it's a very important one. And that's where surface winds will actually push this warm water out further into the ocean, out away from the coast. And then these cool, deep waters from the bottom of the ocean will come up to the surface. And when that happens, they're going to bring with them lots of nutrients. And when those nutrients come up to the surface, lots of life is going to be able to benefit from that. All of the tiny little plankton are going to be able to start to grow, and that's going to attract predators like smaller fish, bigger fish, all the way up to whales. Now let's take a look at a few other baleen whales that benefit from west coast upwelling. So all of these whales are present along the west coast, but you're not likely to see them from shore. They're going to be much further out. So perhaps if you go on a whaling tour or you go out to the Farallon Islands someday, you might be able to see these animals out there. So first we have the blue whale. which I'm sure you know is the largest animal on Earth. In fact, we're in a gym right now with a basketball court. It's going to be about 100 feet long. That is how long these blue whales can be. So just imagine one animal going from end to end of this entire room. And they have a heart the size of a small car, of a Volkswagen Bug. They're not only the biggest animals today, blue whales are the largest animals of all time. They are the biggest animals on Earth of all time. Now, next whale, we have fin whales, which are the second largest whale. And we have minke whales, which are a bit smaller, but are very deep diving. Now, we also have some toothed whales along the west coast. We have sperm whales. We have orcas, which really are a type of dolphin. And we have some beaked whales like Baird's beaked whale. Now, again, you're not likely to see these from shore, but if you were to go to a place like Monterey Bay that has some very deep trenches, there's a chance you could see them around there. And of course, they're going to be further off the coast of the west coast. So this is a map that shows some migration patterns of whales from around the world. You can see that much like birds, the whales are migrating north and south from the equator. They're following the seasons. They're following their prey. Now, information like this is very important when we want to talk about conservation efforts. And speaking of conservation efforts, we have to talk about some of the threats that whales have faced in the past and that they face currently. As I'm sure you know, the whaling industry was very damaging to lots of populations of whales. Humpback whales and blue whales, for example, almost 90 to 95% of the population was lost due to the whaling industry. That means that we almost lost these species forever. So very sad. But fortunately, in 1986, we made an international whaling ban, so most countries have actually stopped hunting whales, and that's allowed the populations to greatly bounce back. Now, even though we're not hunting whales as much anymore, they still face lots of threats. For example, ingesting microplastic. Microplastic, I'm sure you know, is when plastic is very tiny, sometimes so small, we can't even see it with our naked eye. But it's estimated that a blue whale can take in up to 10 million pieces of microplastic per day. Remember, these animals are filter feeders. They're taking in huge amounts of water, and they're filtering out tiny, tiny little creatures. So that really makes sense, and that can be very damaging to their systems. Another huge issue that whales face is entanglement from fishing gear or crabbing gear or other types of marine debris. And you can probably imagine that a whale with entanglement around its flukes, its tail fin, or around its mouth would be having a very hard time being able to swim and feed. And in fact, right now, just last week, scientists have been monitoring a gray whale who's trying to migrate north, but is actually suffering from entanglement around its flukes. And of course, they're going to do what they can when they're able to, but it's a very difficult thing to be able to help animals that large. Now, another thing that affects whales is pollution, just like it affects all marine life. Oil spills can, of course, be very damaging, but there's other types of chemicals that can enter the water as well that can cause harm. Ship strikes are another thing that whales suffer from. It's estimated that roughly 20,000 whales per year die from ship strikes. And that's why information that we were looking at before, like the whale migratory patterns, is so incredibly important. If we can better understand these animals and better understand where they are, we can make conscious decisions to try to avoid them and try to minimize these incidents of ship strikes. And finally, you've probably heard of underwater sound pollution. We can make lots of noise in our oceans depending on where we are. So certain activities like mining or shipping can make our waters very, very noisy. And that can greatly stress out whales and cause even potentially beaching events and disrupt their behavior overall. Looking towards the future, climate change is something that affects all of us, and whales are certainly not immune. Their migratory patterns and where they spend their time feeding are changing depending on where their prey is and ocean temperatures. And also, their prey can be greatly affected by climate change. You've probably heard or may have heard of ocean acidification. That's where carbon dioxide from the air comes into the water and makes carboxylic acid, so a chemical that makes the waters more acidic. That makes certain animals like krill not be able to form their protective shells as well. So it makes it very hard for them to grow. And if the krill, the animals that whales are feeding on, are suffering, then whale populations are going to suffer as well. Now, whales are doing their part in a rather funny way in a process called the whale pump, and that's where whales will dive very deep down into the ocean and they will hunt, and they will come back up to the surface, and then they will eventually use the bathroom, and that will release a cloud of nutrients into the water that will allow phytoplankton and algae, these tiny little marine plants, to be able to bloom and grow. And when plants grow, as we all know, that allows them to photosynthesize, which means they can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it in their bodies. Now, when those tiny plants die, they're going to fall to the ocean floor in a process called marine snow, and that's going to store that carbon or sequester it down at the bottom of the ocean. Now, when whales pass away, of course, it's always a sad thing when a whale passes away. But if a whale passes away out at sea, its body can go down to the sea floor, it can sequester the carbon on the sea floor, and the whale body will actually become a habitat for other animals for up to 100 years. Now, whales are doing their part, so what can we do to help? Well, one of the biggest things that we can do is to use less plastic. Use less single-use plastic in particular. It's estimated that only about 5% of plastic is recycled. So even though recycling is a good thing, it's not the solution that we need to be working towards. We need to use less plastic overall. So what does that mean? Well, when you go out to a restaurant, like a fast food place, every time you go out, if you need to use a plastic fork, that's going to be very wasteful over time. Instead, consider keeping a metal fork in your backpack or in your car. And just think to yourself, how many plastic forks would I not use over my entire life? How many plastic forks would all of us put together not use over our entire lives if we just made a simple practice like committing to doing something more responsible? Now, another thing we can do to help whales and other marine creatures is to help prevent harmful chemicals from getting into our waters. One of the biggest things that you can do as an individual is use an environmentally friendly sunscreen, like a mineral-based sunscreen, instead of the generic sunscreens that are going to be putting those harmful chemicals out. So anytime that you're going to get into the ocean or a river or lakes, because all of our waterways are connected, please use a mineral-based sunscreen. Another thing that we all need to do is to advocate for whales. What does advocacy mean? Well, it means going home, telling your friends and family about the types of things that you learned today. We need people to be interested in these animals if they're going to want to save them. And we need to tell people different ways that we can all help out, like using less plastic.
And we also have to say whale.
That's right. I challenge all of you to become environmental stewards of your area. And what that means is that when you're at school, when you're at home, when you're in your neighborhood or you're at a beach, if you see something wrong, like plastic pollution on the ground or trash, Be part of the solution. Safely, always be safe, pick it up and throw it away. Don't just look at it and think, that's not my trash, that's not my fault, that's not my problem. It's all of our problem, and if we all work together, we can make a big difference in how our planet looks and feels. Another great way is to come out and join the Pacific Beach Coalition for one of our many events. We have events every single weekend, so check out our website, pacificbeachcoalition.org, and sign up for an event and come out and help us keep the ocean and the environment cleaner and learn more really interesting things about creatures like whales. Now, I know that it's already passed, but this last Saturday we had a really big event called Whale Fest. And next year, please keep this in mind, every Earth Day, we do our best to have a really big activity at Pacifica State Beach. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for one of those events. Now let's quickly go over some of the highlights of things that we talked about today. Number one, whales are mammals, which means they have hair and they produce milk. Number two, whales can be grouped into two major groups. Either they're going to be toothed whales or they're going to be baleen whales, with that baleen made out of keratin. Blue whales are the largest animals to have ever existed, while sperm whales are the loudest animals on Earth, louder than a jet engine taking off. And finally, whales really need our help. So let's advocate for whales. Let's use less plastic. Let's all try to be part of the solution. And we would really love to see you out for one of our events. Thank you all so much for being such a great audience. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, can we give one more big, huge round of applause for All right, before we leave, you guys did a wonderful job being a great audience. Before we leave, Greg shared with us something that's really important, and for a way for us to kind of connect with whales and in the preservation of their habitat. And that was that we can take action in small ways that work collectively, right? That we can all together do our part to help keep our beaches clean, our watersheds clean, our neighborhoods clean, because it's all connected, right? So a couple of things, guys, just to be thinking about this week during Coast Week. One of those is that on Saturday, we will have a beach cleanup at Poplar Beach. And we are hoping that you and your families will come and show up and help us to keep the beach clean, right? It's amazing how we can clean it so well. Our third and fourth graders have been going every month. And yet, a week later, we come back and there's tons more trash that's come down for our watersheds, or that's blown onto or coming from the ocean, right? The other thing is that we have a number of you, raise your hand if you picked up a bag this morning. Did anyone pick up a bag when we had our booth in the morning? Okay, so we will be every morning for the Coast Week, we will have a big bucket of bags, and we have a sign-up sheet. If you take a bag, we have these are bags that are disposable bags that we have asked people to donate. So with those bags, if you can fill that with trash that comes from either it can be your neighborhood, right? Because everything that goes into the storm drains ends up into our waterways and into the ocean, right? It can come from a sporting field if you're out playing or you're watching a sibling in a sporting event, right? You can go to the beach, you can go anywhere within our watershed, right? If you can fill that bag with trash and bring it back, we'll sort it and we'll celebrate you. We have little gifts that we'll share with you guys when you bring them back. Speaking of gifts, Mr. Finkelstein brought us some really cool pins, and I will be sharing those with your teachers today before you go home, and some bookmarks to put in your books. So those will be a chance for you. People will probably ask you to put them in a special spot. Put them in a special spot. Put them on your backpack. Put them on a sweatshirt that you wear a lot, so that people ask you, and then you can share the message with us. Tell them about what you know about them and how we can help take care for them. All right.
One more thing?
Yes, absolutely.
And everyone, that's so great. And I can get your attention just for one more minute here. That's so incredible that you're all making these efforts to make the world a better place. I really applaud you. That's great. we're going to do one more thing. We're going to take the Earth Hero Pledge, where we're all going to commit to being Earth heroes and helping out the environment, being a part of positive change. So I want you to put your hands up with me, and this is a repeat after me. We're going to say it nice and loud and clearly so that maybe even the whales can hear. Are you ready? All right, here we go. I pledge to do my part. To keep our beaches and oceans free from trash. I will pick up litter. Recycle. Compost. And use less plastic. I will advocate for whales. By fighting climate change and pollution. I pledge to show respect for nature. And all living things. And to use my voice to speak up for the earth and oceans. You are all now Earth heroes. Thank you so much for the